The man who discovered America died convinced he'd never been there. He made 4 voyages across the Atlantic. He walked the beaches of the Caribbean. He stood on the shores of South America. He sailed along the coast of Central America, close enough to Panama that the Pacific Ocean was just a few days' march away. And yet, to his dying breath, he never once doubted that he had found something else entirely. He thought it was Asia. He thought it was the outer edge of the Empire of China, the islands Marco Polo described in his legendary travels. He was wrong. Spectacularly, historically, world-changingly wrong. And here's the real kicker. Without that exact error, he never would have sailed at all. But there's something even wilder. Before Columbus, before his 3 ships, before October of 1492, another group of Europeans had already done it. They crossed the Atlantic. They found the land. They settled it, lived there, built shelters, fished the rivers, clashed with the locals. They made it 500 years before Columbus even picked up a compass. The world forgot. Europe forgot. The discovery vanished so completely that for centuries, historians called it a fairy tale, a Norse bedtime story, something to tell children around a fire in Iceland, not real history, not something that actually happened, until archaeologists dug up the proof in the frozen ground of Newfoundland. So here's what nobody's textbook ever quite told you straight. The story of how America was discovered is actually a story about 3 things. A memory that got lost, a calculation that was wrong, and a name that belongs to a man. Subscribe if this already has you leaning forward, because we're just getting started, and it gets stranger from here. Around the year 1000, Europe was a mess. Kingdoms fighting kingdoms, plague, feudal lords grinding peasants into the mud. While Paris argued over who owned what patch of France, something extraordinary was happening in the cold, gray waters of the North Atlantic. Viking longships were pushing west. They had already crossed to Iceland. That wasn't enough. They crossed to Greenland. Still not enough. Now the most restless of them were staring at the horizon beyond Greenland, wondering what was out there. Let's back up slightly, because the backstory here is remarkable. There was a man named Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Erik the Red, because of the hair and beard that matched his violent temper. Norwegian by birth, exiled from Norway for killing a man, Iceland came next. Another killing, another blood feud. Viking society had tolerance for violence up to a point, but not for a man who kept restarting the cycle. The Icelandic assembly banished him for 3 years. 3 years, nowhere to go. So Erik loaded a ship and sailed west, into water no Norseman had charted. He found an enormous island, massive, mostly covered in ice and rock and brutal cold. But he explored the southern coastline, found patches where the grass grew, and realized people could survive here, if they were tough enough. When his 3-year exile ended, Erik returned to Iceland with a plan. He needed settlers. He needed people to come back with him and build something. So he named this ice-covered, mostly frozen, genuinely terrible island Greenland. Green land. That was the sales pitch. Greenland. Lush. Inviting. Don't worry about the glaciers. It was the first real estate scam in Atlantic history. And it worked. People came. They established colonies. Erik became their chief. His son, Leif Eriksson, grew up among ice and stone and salt wind, strong and curious, and always looking west. Here's where the story gets interesting. A merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing to Greenland to visit his father when a storm blew him off course. He ended up somewhere unexpected, somewhere with low green hills and thick forests stretching into the distance. Not the jagged black cliffs of Greenland, not ice, trees, actual trees. Bjarni was a practical man. He was going to see his father. He turned the ship around and found Greenland, where he told people what he'd seen. A land to the west, green, forested, unknown. Leif Eriksson heard this story and couldn't let it go. Around the year 1000, Leif bought Bjarni's ship, the same one that had accidentally found this new land, assembled a crew of roughly 35 men, and sailed west with Bjarni's directions as his only guide. What happened next is one of history's quietest revolutions. Leif's crew found 3 different lands. The first was brutal. Flat slabs of gray rock jutting out of freezing water, not a blade of grass anywhere. Leif named it Helluland, land of flat stones. Today, we know it as Baffin Island, up in the Canadian Arctic. They didn't stay. The second land was better, dramatically better. Forests. Actual forests stretching to the horizon, the trees dense and tall. For men who lived on the bare rocks of Greenland, where timber was worth its weight in silver, this was staggering. Leif named it Markland, land of forests. We know it now as Labrador, in northeastern Canada. They catalogued it and kept sailing. The third land stopped them cold. Green meadows rolling back from the shoreline, rivers thick with salmon, more salmon than any of them had ever seen, so thick in the water you could practically step across their backs. A mild climate, nothing like the bite of Greenland winters, and then something that made even the most hardened Viking crewmen stop and stare. Wild grapes. Grapevines growing in the open, untended, dripping with fruit. In these latitudes, grapes. The crew could make wine. Leif called this place Vinland, the land of wine, and he meant it as the highest possible compliment. They built shelters. They spent the winter. They caught salmon, felled timber, gathered grapes. In the spring, Leif loaded his ship with lumber and berries and headed back to Greenland. On the way home, he spotted a ship wrecked on a reef, 15 survivors clinging to the rocks. He rescued all of them. That act of luck and generosity earned him his lasting nickname, Leif the Lucky. Europeans had wintered in America. They had eaten its fish, drunk its wild wine, slept under its skies, 500 years before Columbus. The story didn't end with Leif. His brother, Torvald, wanted to see this paradise for himself. He took the same ship, the same route, and arrived in Vinland the following year. And that's when things went sideways. The Norse called the people they encountered Quote One, a dismissive term, almost certainly referring to the Algonquian-speaking peoples of northeastern North America, possibly Beothuk, or ancestors of the Mi'kmaq. The first encounter was tense. The Vikings found 9 of them sleeping under upturned canoes. They killed 8 of them, just like that. No provocation, no exchange. A Viking reflex for dealing with strangers. The 9th man escaped. What followed was inevitable. The Skraelings came back in force. Dozens of canoes crossing the water, arrows filling the air. Thorvald was hit. He pulled out the arrow, looked at the wound, and reportedly said something along the lines of, "We found a fertile country, though we'll hardly enjoy much of it." He died that day, buried on American soil with a cross planted over his grave, the first Christian grave in the Western Hemisphere. His crew sailed back to Greenland with the news, but the attempts continued. Leif's brother-in-law and a remarkable woman named Gudrid came next, leading a larger group. They traded with the Skraelings, furs for red cloth, an early Atlantic economy. For a while it seemed like coexistence might be possible. Then a bull from their livestock wandered out of the settlement, and the noise terrified the Skraelings into a panic. Arrows flew. The fragile peace shattered. There was one last attempt, led by Leif's half-sister Freydis, a woman who, by the sagas, had an iron will and a ruthless streak to match. Her expedition ended badly, in internal violence and failure, and when she returned to Greenland, the story of Vinland had become too costly, too complicated, too dangerous. The Norse simply stopped going. Think about that for a moment. They had found it. They knew it was there. They had the ships. They had the knowledge of the route. But the settlement was too far from Greenland. Greenland was too far from Iceland. Iceland was too far from Norway. There were too few people, The Skraelings were too many and too hostile. Every expedition required enormous resources for a reward that kept turning lethal. So the voyages ended. The settlement was abandoned. The sagas, the Old Norse word for stories, essentially long oral histories passed down through generations, kept the memory alive, but barely. By the time Iceland was trading less with the European mainland, by the time Greenland's own colonies were shrinking and struggling to survive, the tales of Vinland had drifted from history into legend, from legend into myth, from myth into something that sounded, to a 15th century European scholar, like the kind of thing old sailors made up to entertain their grandchildren. And here is the devastating irony. The sagas were telling the truth the entire time. In 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein, started digging at a place called Lons o Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. What they found stopped the academic world cold. Turf-built structures, iron nails, a Norse-style bronze pin, a spindle whorl, carbon-dated to almost exactly the year 1000. Viking. Definitively, unambiguously Viking. Everything the sagas described was real. Europeans had crossed the Atlantic, built homes in America, and walked away. The greatest secret in the history of exploration had been hiding in the ground in Newfoundland for 1,000 years. But as the sagas slowly faded from memory and 1,000 years passed, Europe remained completely unaware that another continent existed. No maps changed, no trade routes shifted, no monarchs sent ships westward. The knowledge died. And into that vacuum, 5 centuries later, walked a stubborn, red-haired Genoese sailor with a map that was wrong and a dream that was about to accidentally change everything. To understand what drove Columbus, you have to understand one word, one single word that made European kings lose sleep and merchants salivate and explorers risk their lives in open ocean. Spices. Not spices the way we think of them today, little jars on a kitchen shelf bought at a grocery store for a few dollars. Spices in the 1500s was something closer to what oil is now. Strategic, essential, worth killing over. Here's why. In an era before refrigeration, before canning, before any way to preserve meat other than salting and smoking, spices were the difference between eating edible food and gagging down something that had started to rot 3 days ago. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. These weren't flavorings. They were technology. They were preservation. They were medicine. A merchant who controlled the pepper supply controlled something that every single person in Europe needed, every single day. A bag of pepper in the markets of Venice could fetch the same price as a bag of silver. Not an exaggeration. Contemporary records confirm it. Cloves were so valuable that a sailor who completed a single successful voyage to the Spice Islands could retire on what he brought back in his coat pockets. The problem was geography. All of this, the pepper, the cinnamon, the cloves, came from South and Southeast Asia, and between Europe and Asia stood the entire Islamic world, stretched across the Middle East and North Africa in an unbroken commercial empire. Arab merchants bought spices in India at origin prices, then sold them to European buyers at markups that would make a modern hedge fund manager blush. Every transaction, every port, every middleman took a cut. By the time a bag of pepper reached Florence, it had passed through a dozen hands, and the price had multiplied tenfold. European kings hated this. Merchants hated this. The Catholic Church, which controlled much of the continent's wealth, hated watching fortunes flow eastward into Muslim hands. What they needed was a direct route, sea route. No middlemen, no Arab toll collectors, just a ship, the wind, and the open ocean. Portugal understood this first. The Portuguese had geography on their side. Their kingdom sat on the southwestern edge of Europe, pointing like an arrow toward the Atlantic. Their sailors were among the most experienced in the world. having fished the deep waters off Newfoundland, ironically, for generations. Their Prince Henry, who history calls _quote_for_, made it a national project. Year after year, decade after decade, Portuguese captains pushed further down the western coast of Africa. Each expedition went a little further than the last. The logic was airtight. Sail far enough south around Africa, then turn east, and you'd reach India from below, cutting the Arab world out of the equation entirely. It was a marathon strategy. It worked, but it was going to take decades. In the meantime, a Florentine astronomer named Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli had a different idea. Toscanelli knew what every educated European of his time knew, that the Earth was a sphere. This was not controversial. The ancient Greeks had established it. Medieval scholars accepted it. The flat Earth myth is itself a myth. No serious thinker in the 1500s believed the planet was a disk. The question was never the shape of the Earth. The question was the size, and specifically, how much ocean lay between Europe's western coast and Asia's eastern edge. Toscanelli studied the available maps, read the available accounts, did his calculations, and concluded the Atlantic was crossable. Not trivially easy, but crossable. The direct western route to Asia was shorter than the route around Africa. He wrote a letter saying so. He sent it to the Portuguese court. They ignored him. But a copy of that letter found its way into the hands of a man who was about to stake his entire life on it. Picture the waterfront of Genoa in the middle of the 1500s. A bustling Mediterranean port, noise and salt air and the creak of rigging. Ships from everywhere. Merchants in silk next to sailors in rags. The smell of tar and fish and trade. In a wool weaver's workshop above one of those streets, a boy was growing up who would become the most consequential and most confused navigator in history. Cristoforo Colombo. We know him as Christopher Columbus. He was tall, broad-shouldered, light-skinned, with reddish hair that would go white early. He had a sailor's restlessness in him from the start, the kind of restlessness that makes sitting still feel like punishment. By his early teens, he was already shipping out on trading vessels, learning the Mediterranean routes, watching how navigators read the stars and the winds and the color of the water. He read voraciously. He devoured Marco Polo's accounts of the East, the cities of Cathay, China, the gold-roofed palaces of Cipango, Japan, the spice islands of the Indies. Marco Polo described a civilization of such overwhelming wealth that it seemed like fantasy even to people who lived in an era of kings and cathedrals. Columbus believed every word. He sailed to Portugal in his mid-20s and based himself in Lisbon, the epicenter of the age of exploration. He married well, a Portuguese noblewoman whose father had been a navigator under Prince Henry. He worked with his brother Bartholomew, drawing and selling maps. He sailed to West Africa with Portuguese expeditions. He may have voyaged as far as Iceland, where he might have caught fragments of the old Norse stories about a land to the west. But if he did, those stories were too vague to act on. What he needed was a theory. Toscanelli's letter gave him one. When Columbus read it, something clicked into place. He took Toscanelli's calculations and, characteristically, pushed them even further. He recalculated the size of the Earth, using a combination of Ptolemy's geography and his own hopeful arithmetic, and reached a conclusion that was magnificently, dangerously wrong. He decided the Earth was smaller than it actually is. Much smaller. He decided Asia extended further east than it actually does. And combining those two errors, he arrived at a figure for the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan that was, give or take, about 1/4 of the actual distance. He thought the crossing was a manageable voyage of a few weeks. The real answer was an ocean so vast that without the American continent sitting in the middle of it, his ships would have run out of food and water somewhere in the mid-Pacific. And that would have been the end of Columbus, his crew, and probably the entire concept of Western navigation for a generation. Here's the brutal truth that the textbooks gloss over. Every single expert who evaluated Columbus's proposal correctly identified the error. The Portuguese Royal Commission, assembled by King João II, who was nobody's fool, studied Columbus's figures, did their own math, and told the king plainly, "This man has miscalculated. The ocean is far larger than he thinks. An expedition on his timeline would run out of supplies and die at sea." They were right. Columbus was wrong. And yet, he didn't quit. The Portuguese said no in 1483. Columbus picked up his charts and his wounded pride and moved to Spain. He requested an audience with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the young monarchs who had just unified the fractured kingdoms of Spain through their marriage, and were in the middle of a generational war to push the last Muslim kingdom off the Iberian Peninsula. They listened to his pitch. They were intrigued. Who wouldn't be intrigued by the promise of a shortcut to Asia's legendary wealth? But Isabella and Ferdinand had a war to finish. Granada, the last Moorish stronghold, was still holding out. Every coin, every soldier, every moment of royal attention was pointed at that war. Columbus was told, "Wait." So he waited. He waited while his youth faded and his hair went white. He waited while Portuguese ships edged further down the African coast and the Grenada War ground on. He survived on a modest stipend from the royal court, haunting the corridors of power, making his case over and over again to anyone who would listen. He had a son, Diego, and raised him largely alone after his wife died. He tried his luck with the English court. He sent his brother Bartholomew to pitch the French. Every door closed. 7 years. 7 years of waiting, arguing, demonstrating, pleading. 7 years of watching other men become heroes, while he stood in anterooms with his rolled-up charts and his impossible dream. 7 years of people telling him, politely and not so politely, that he had made a mistake in his calculations and should probably go home. He was right about one thing, though: the obstinate refusal to accept the judgment of people who were smarter than him about the math, which is simultaneously admirable and terrifying. Then, on January 2nd of 1492, the war ended. Granada fell. The last Muslim king of Spain handed over the keys to his palace to Ferdinand and Isabella, and 7 centuries of Moorish civilization on the Iberian Peninsula ended in an afternoon. Spain erupted in celebration. The monarchs were flush with victory, glowing with the sense that history was on their side, that God himself was steering their kingdom toward greatness. Columbus came to them one last time. Isabella looked at the charts. She thought about the Portuguese and their Africa route, almost certainly going to reach India within years. She thought about what it would mean to hand this opportunity to the French or the English if Columbus was right. She thought about the risk, but she thought more about the potential prize. She said yes. The contract was extraordinary. In the event of success, Columbus would receive the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He would be appointed Viceroy, effectively the governor, of any lands he discovered. He would receive 1/10 of all wealth brought back from the new territories. He, a weaver's son from Genoa, would become a nobleman, a lord, a viceroy of empire. The stakes couldn't have been higher. And on the 3rd of August, 1492, standing on the dock at Palos de la Frontera in the gray light before dawn, Columbus watched 3 ships being provisioned for the most consequential voyage in history. He didn't have impressive ships. Let's be honest about that. The Santa Maria was the largest of the 3, and she was what sailors called a nau, a broad, deep-hulled cargo carrier, not built for speed or exploration. She was sturdy but awkward, difficult to maneuver in shallow water, the kind of ship you'd take across a well-charted sea, not into the unknown. She was Columbus's flagship by default, and he would come to deeply regret it before the voyage was over. The other 2 were caravels, smaller and faster. The Pinta, named prosaically for previous owners, was nimble and quick, captained by Martín Alonso Pinzón, who was arguably the most experienced sailor of the 3 commanders, and knew it. The Niña, the smallest of the 3, was technically named Santa Clara, but everyone called her by the nickname. It means underscore underscore quote underscore quote underscore underscore underscore. And she would ultimately prove to be the most reliable vessel of the fleet, the one that got Columbus home alive. 90 men, roughly, spread across these 3 ships. And here's a detail that tends to get left out of the heroic version of this story. Many of the crew were convicted criminals who had been offered a stark choice by the Spanish crown: join Columbus's expedition or stay in prison. Some of them chose the expedition, presumably deciding that even a terrifying voyage into the unknown was preferable to a Spanish jail. The Pinzon brothers were essential. Without their credibility with the local sailors of Palos, Columbus, a foreigner, a Genoese, an outsider, would have had serious trouble recruiting a crew at all. Martin Alonso even lent Columbus money for the voyage's expenses out of his own pocket. They stopped at the Canary Islands for repairs and resupply. The Pinta's rudder had fractured almost immediately after leaving Palos, which was either an accident or, as Martin Alonso darkly suspected, sabotage by owners of the ship who hadn't wanted to lend her in the first place. The repairs took over a month. By the time the fleet was ready to depart again, it was September. September 6th, they cleared the last island. It was almost too good. The northeast trade winds were blowing hard, and the sea was rough. The boat was moving fast, and the crew was working hard. The captain was shouting orders, and the passengers were holding on for dear life. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning pink. The crew was exhausted, but they were still going strong. The captain was smiling, and the passengers were cheering. The boat was moving fast, and the sea was rough. The crew was working hard, and the captain was shouting orders. The passengers were holding on for dear life, and the sun was setting. The sky was turning pink, and the crew was exhausted, but they were still going strong. The captain was smiling, and the passengers were cheering. The boat was moving fast, and the sea was rough. The crew was working hard, and the captain was shouting orders. The passengers were holding on for dear life, and the sun was setting. The sky was turning pink, and the crew was exhausted, but they were still going strong. The captain was smiling, and the passengers were cheering. The boat was moving fast, and the sea was rough. The crew was working hard, and the captain was shouting orders. The passengers were holding on for dear life, and the sun was setting. The sky was turning pink, and the crew was exhausted, but they were still going strong. The captain was smiling, and the passengers were cheering. The boat was moving fast, and the sea was rough. The crew was working hard, and the captain was shouting orders. The passengers were holding on for dear life, and the sun was setting. The sky was turning pink, and the crew was exhausted, but they were still going strong. The captain was smiling, and the passengers were cheering. The boat was moving fast, and the sea was rough. The crew was working hard, and the captain was shouting orders. The passengers were holding on for dear life, and the sun was setting. The sky was turning pink, and the crew was exhausted, but they were still going strong. The captain was smiling, and the passengers were cheering. The boat was moving fast, and the sea was rough. The crew was working hard, and the captain was shouting orders. The passengers were holding on for dear life, and the sun was setting. The sky was turning pink, and the crew was exhausted, but they were still going strong. The captain was smiling, and the passengers were cheering. The boat was moving fast, and the sea was rough. The crew was working hard, and the captain was shouting orders. The passengers were holding on for dear life, and the sun was setting. The sky was turning pink, and the crew was exhausted, but they were still going strong. The captain was smiling, and the passengers were cheering. The boat was moving fast, and the sea was rough. The crew was working hard, and the captain was shouting orders. The captain was almost too good. The northeast trade winds filled the sails and pushed the ships steadily westward at a pace that had Columbus privately calculating. Japan by early October, certainly. The sky was clear, the seas were calm, and the men, whatever their private doubts, were carried along on the momentum of good weather and quick miles. Then they hit the Sargasso Sea. If you've never seen it, the Sargasso Sea is one of the strangest places on the planet. A region of the Atlantic where dense mats of golden-brown seaweed called sargassum float in enormous drifting islands, sometimes miles across, packing together so thickly the water seems to have grown a skin. No one on Columbus's crew had ever seen anything like it. The ships slowed as they pushed through the weed. Sailors leaned over the railings and stared down into water that looked, under certain light, like it was concealing something. Rumors moved through the fleet like smoke. The sargassum was a sign that the sea ahead was too shallow for sailing. The ships would run aground, far from land, and sink slowly into warm, green water, with no rescue possible. Some whispered about sea monsters in the weed, this being an era when sea monsters were a completely rational fear, given that no one knew what was actually in the deep ocean. Columbus kept the ships moving. He had no choice. Stopping was just dying more slowly. The sargassum thinned, the ships pushed through, open water again, but the damage was done. To morale, if not to the hulls. And then Columbus did something that historians still debate. According to the account passed down through Bartolomé de las Casas, the priest who later compiled and summarized Columbus's journal, Columbus kept two sets of distance records. One that he shared with the crew, showing shorter distances, and a private one with the real figures. The logic, if the story is accurate, would have been straightforward. Sailors who didn't know how far they'd come from Spain would be less likely to calculate that Japan was already somewhere behind them. Some modern researchers think Las Casas misread the original, and that Columbus was simply recording distances in two different units of measurement, Portuguese leagues for the crew, Spanish ones for himself, with no intent to deceive. The truth is lost with the original journal. What isn't lost is the result. The crew was scared, the food was rotting, and Columbus was holding the expedition together through a combination of authority and sheer refusal to turn around. Weeks passed. The scale of the crossing becomes something you have to feel rather than just follow on a map. These men were in the middle of an ocean, with no land in any direction, on wooden ships not much longer than a tennis court end to end, eating preserved food that was beginning to rot in the tropical heat, drinking water that tasted of the wooden barrels it was stored in. At night, the sky above them was nothing but stars. No artificial light anywhere on Earth. The Milky Way blazing from horizon to horizon, beautiful and vertiginous, a reminder of exactly how small and alone they were. By early October, Columbus's schedule had already broken down. He had told the crew, and told himself, that Japan would appear within weeks of leaving the Canaries. Weeks had come and gone, and there was nothing. The food situation was getting critical. Men were getting sick. Arguments were breaking out below decks. On October 7th, the crew saw what seemed like a sign. Enormous flocks of birds flying overhead, heading southwest. Columbus had read enough nautical accounts to know that birds generally meant land nearby. He changed course slightly, following them. Still nothing. On October 10th, it nearly ended. A group of sailors came to Columbus and put it plainly. They had gone too far. Whatever he thought was out there, they had passed it. The ocean had no other shore. Or, if it did, it was so far away that the expedition could never survive the crossing. They demanded he turn the ships around and go home. Now, before they were too far from Spain to make it back alive. This was not a polite disagreement. This was the edge of a mutiny. Columbus negotiated. He bargained. He cajoled. He pointed to the birds, to the green plant matter floating past in the water, to what he claimed were signs of land. He made a deal. 3 more days. If they saw nothing in 3 more days, he would turn back. He was playing for his life, in every possible sense. The ships sailed on. October 11th. The signs intensified. Green branches floating in the water, a carved wooden board, a flowering plant. Columbus stood at the bow of the Santa Maria and watched the horizon until his eyes burned. Every man on every ship was awake, staring forward. Then midnight came and passed. 2 o'clock in the morning of October 12th, 1492. On the Pinta, running slightly ahead of the fleet, a young sailor named Rodrigo de Triana was on watch. He had been staring at a black horizon for 5 weeks. Through panic and boredom and the creeping suspicion that he had made a terrible mistake in agreeing to this voyage, he was exhausted in the deep, cellular way of a man who has been afraid for weeks without being allowed to show it. He looked west into the darkness, and then a line. A pale, uneven line against the sky, right at the horizon, different from water, different from clouds, unmistakable once you'd been looking for it long enough. Land. He screamed it, not spoke it, not called it out, screamed it. Quote 6. The Portuguese say he beat the ship's cannon with his fist before he managed to fire the signal shot. The explosion split the night air, and on all 3 ships, men who had been asleep, or half asleep, or staring blankly at the dark, came alive at once, stumbling to the railings, straining forward, and yes, there it was. The new world was sitting there in the dark, waiting. Columbus would later claim that he had seen a faint light flickering on the horizon a few hours before Rodrigo's cry, a glimmer, like a candle being moved. He claimed this to get the reward Isabella and Ferdinand had promised to the first person to spot land. Rodrigo, the man who actually saw it, never received a coin. History is rarely fair to the man on watch. The 3 ships slowed and lay at anchor in the darkness, too wise to approach an unknown coast in the middle of the night. The current pulled at the hulls, the stars wheeled overhead, and 90 men tried to process what was about to happen. In a few hours, they would step onto a shore that no person from their world had ever touched, or so they believed. Dawn broke on October 12th slowly, the way Caribbean dawns do, gradual and warm, the dark peeling back from the water, to reveal a scene that must have stopped every man's heart for a moment. The island was low and flat, covered in dense green vegetation, fringed with white sand that glowed in the early light. Palm trees of a kind they had never seen, clear turquoise water that showed the bottom through fathoms of depth. The air smelled of flowers and salt, and something green and alive, a smell completely unlike anything in southern Spain or the Canary Islands. Columbus had himself rowed ashore in a longboat, dressed in his most formal clothing, a gesture at the theater of empire, even here at the edge of the world. He carried the royal banner of Castile and Aragon. Behind him came the captains of the Pinta and Nina, and a notary whose job was to make this legally binding. Columbus knelt on the beach and wept. Then he stood up, planted the royal standard in the sand, and announced, to an empty beach, to the trees, to whatever invisible legal machinery recorded these things, that this island was hereafter the possession of the Spanish crown. He named it San Salvador, Holy Savior. The notary wrote it all down. Everyone present signed as witnesses. By the logic of 15th century European law, the island had just changed ownership. Then they heard noise from the tree line, and people stepped out of the forest. They were Taino. That is the name history gives them now, though Columbus didn't know it. They belonged to a civilization that had spread across the Caribbean islands over centuries. Skilled farmers, skilled fishermen, skilled navigators in their own right. They lived in villages of dozens or hundreds, organized around chieftains, bound by complex social customs. They were not primitives stumbling out of the jungle. They were a people who had perfected survival in these islands across generations. What they made of the 3 strange objects that had appeared on the water overnight, no one recorded from their side. From Columbus's side, we have his journal. He described them as beautiful, tall, well-built, with dark eyes and straight black hair worn loose. Many had painted their bodies, red and white and black pigments in patterns that Columbus couldn't read, but which almost certainly carried meaning, status, identity, spiritual significance. They moved carefully toward the strange men on the beach, stopping to look, retreating a step, advancing again. Columbus made the first move. He reached into a bag and produced glass beads, bright, cheap. Then they brought out things of their own. To trade. Small things, food, parrots. And some of them, Columbus noticed almost immediately, wore things in their noses and ears that caught the sun in a way glass never would. Gold. Small amounts. Simple rings and discs. Not the heaping treasure vaults of Marco Polo's imagination, not the gilded palaces of Cipango, but unmistakably, indisputably, gold. Columbus asked, through gesture and a kind of manic pointing at the metal, where did this come from? The Taino gestured back, south, or west, or over that way, the direction imprecise across the communication gap, somewhere else. Took 6 of them aboard his ships to use as guides and interpreters. He did not ask them. That sentence, written so casually in his journal, mentioned almost as an afterthought, is the first note of a theme that would define everything that came after. Columbus was not arriving in an empty land. He was arriving in a land full of people, and his framework for understanding those people did not include the concept that their lives were fully equivalent to European lives, that their wishes about captivity and servitude deserved the same weight as the wishes of a Spanish nobleman. This was the 15th century. These were the operating assumptions of his world. That doesn't make it less monstrous. It just means the monstrousness had a context, and that context was about to scale to a degree that Columbus himself couldn't have imagined, standing on that beach in the warm October morning. For now, he was just a navigator, and he had a continent to find. The Bahamas were not what Columbus was looking for. They were beautiful, impossibly blue water over white sand, coconut palms, warm air, extraordinarily friendly people. But beauty was not on the manifest. Gold was on the manifest. Silk was on the manifest. The spice markets of China were on the manifest. Columbus spent weeks island hopping through the Bahamas, each time following the signs, another gesture south, another story told through the impossible barrier of language, about a bigger island, more gold, a great chief. He picked up more Taino guides at each stop. His fleet threaded through shallow turquoise channels, the sailors dangling over the bows to watch for reefs, and on October 28th, they saw it. A massive island appeared on the horizon, mountains rising blue and dark against the sky, the kind of real geological presence that the flat Bahamas couldn't offer, big enough to be a country. Columbus stood at the bow of the Pinta and felt, with absolute certainty, that this was it. This was China. Not an island, not another chain of Caribbean atolls. The mainland. The empire. The place Marco Polo described. He called it Juana, a royal name, for a royal discovery. Today, we know it as Cuba. The Spanish ships anchored in a river mouth and went ashore. The vegetation was extraordinary. Columbus's journal becomes almost lyrical here, describing the beauty of the landscape with an intensity that suggests even he, through all his obsession with gold, was genuinely stunned by what he was seeing. Birds of colors Europe didn't have. Trees he couldn't name. The air thick with scent. But the cities were missing. Columbus sent 2 men inland with written letters addressed to the Great Khan of China, requesting an audience. The ambassadors returned after several days, with no imperial ambassador, no silk-robed officials, no response from any recognizable state apparatus. Just more villages, more hospitable people with simple houses and small amounts of gold. Columbus adjusted his theory rather than his conclusion. This wasn't the center of the empire. This was a province, an outlying region. The capital would be further on. He kept going. That's when the Taino guides pointed him east, toward another large island. On December 6th, the fleet sailed into a harbor so wide and calm and green that Columbus wrote it reminded him of home. He named the island Hispaniola, Little Spain. It was the most Spanish-looking landscape he'd found. Rolling hills, good river valleys, soil that even to a sailor's eye looked fertile enough to grow anything. The locals were Taino as well, ruled by a chief named Guacanagari, and they were the most welcoming people Columbus had yet encountered. Guacanagari appears to have genuinely believed, at least initially, that the strangers arriving in their floating houses might be something supernatural, spirits from beyond the water, deserving of reverence and gifts. He sent his people out to the ships with food. He came himself to greet Columbus. He offered shelter, guided the Spanish to the best anchorages, brought out gold ornaments to trade. Columbus was in a state of barely controlled elation. This was it. This was the wealth he'd promised Isabella and Ferdinand. Not the levels of the Ming dynasty, perhaps, but clearly the outer rim of something. The gold was coming from somewhere inland. The people kept pointing to mountains to the south. There were rivers that glinted. He wrote his letters home. He began planning how to communicate to his sovereigns the extraordinary nature of what he'd found. And then, on Christmas night, everything went wrong. December 25th, 1492, Christmas. The Santa Maria was working her way along the northern coast of Hispaniola in the dark, the sea calm, the wind light. Columbus had been awake for days. The strain of navigation, the constant state of high alert, the pressure of being responsible for 3 ships and 90 lives in uncharted water. He finally went below to sleep. He left the helmsman in charge. The helmsman, also exhausted, handed the tiller to a ship's boy, one of the younger crew members, inexperienced, not supposed to be standing watch alone under any circumstances. The boy let the ship drift. The Santa Maria ran onto a coral reef at low speed, but with a finality that was immediately clear to everyone who felt the impact. A grinding shudder through the entire hull, then the horrible stillness of a ship that has stopped moving because it has become part of the sea floor. Columbus was on deck within seconds. They tried everything. They threw ballast overboard to lighten the ship. They tried to haul her off with an anchor and a rope. Nothing worked. The sea was small that night, but persistent, and each gentle swell worked the hull a little further onto the reef, and the seams opened, and the water came in. By morning, the Santa Maria was gone, a sodden wreck on a Haitian reef, useful now only for her timber. Columbus's first emotion, after the horror of watching his flagship die, was something close to despair, and then something shifted. He looked at the timber. He looked at the friendly Guacanagari watching from shore. He looked at his crew. 90 men and only 2 ships capable of carrying maybe half of them back to Spain. If he couldn't take everyone home, someone had to stay. He made a decision that was either brilliantly practical, or, depending on how it turned out, a death sentence for the men he left behind. From the timbers of the Santa Maria, Columbus's crew built a small fort on the shore. They mounted the ship's cannons in it. They stockpiled food and water, and 39 volunteers, or men with no better option, agreed to garrison it until Columbus came back with the supply fleet. Columbus named the fort La Navidad, Christmas. Then he took the Nina and the Pinta, pointed them east, and began the long run home. The return was brutal in ways the outbound crossing wasn't. Going west with the trade winds had been almost serene. Coming back meant fighting against them, working north through the Atlantic until the ships could catch the westerlies that blow east toward Europe, then riding those across. The route existed. Portuguese sailors had figured it out years before, but it required precise navigation and considerable luck with the weather. Columbus's luck ran out in mid-February. A storm hit the fleet somewhere in the mid-Atlantic with a ferocity that convinced many of the sailors they were going to die. The Nina and the Pinta separated in the dark and the howling wind, each ship losing sight of the other in the chaos, each crew convinced for days afterward that the other ship had gone down and they alone had survived to bring the news back to Spain. Columbus, on the Nina, made a remarkable practical decision in the worst hours of the storm. He wrote out a summary of his discoveries on a piece of parchment, sealed it in a waxed cloth, put it in a barrel, and threw it into the sea. The idea was simple. Even if the Nina sank, maybe the barrel would make it to Spain, and the knowledge of what they'd found would survive. The barrel was never found. The Nina made it instead. battered but intact, and limped first into the harbor at Lisbon, which, given the political landscape, was an awkward place for a Spanish expedition to turn up, and then finally home to Palos on the 15th of March, 1493. The Pinta arrived the same day. Martín Alonso Pinzón, the captain who had been so essential to making the voyage possible, who had held the crew together through the darkest weeks of the crossing, had hoped to reach Spain first and go directly to the king and queen himself, claiming at least a share of the glory. He was desperately ill by the time the Pinta docked, worn down by the voyage in a way that turned out to be fatal. He died within weeks of arriving home, before Columbus had even completed his triumphant progress to Barcelona to present himself to the court. The world forgets the second man home. Barcelona, April of 1493. Columbus made his entrance the way a man enters when he knows that history is watching. He brought with him everything he could carry that would demonstrate the astonishing reality of what he'd found. Parrots, colorful, tropical, nothing like anything Spain had ever seen, squawking and brilliant on their perches. Plant specimens, strange fruits. The gold, such as it was, not the mountains of it he'd promised, but enough to gleam. He brought people, too. 7 Taino men and women who had survived the voyage, dressed in what the Spanish had put on them, bewildered by the noise and the cold and the stone streets and the thousands of European faces staring at them. They had been taken from their islands without any meaningful consent and carried to a continent they didn't know existed, to be displayed before monarchs who had just claimed ownership of their homeland. The court of Ferdinand and Isabella received Columbus with ceremony. He was given the titles he'd been promised: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy. He gave his formal report. He spread his maps on the table and described what he'd seen. Spain erupted. The popular imagination needs a moment like this sometimes, a moment of pure, uncomplicated triumph, before the complications arrive. Columbus had crossed the Atlantic and come back alive, with proof of what lay on the other side. He had done what everyone said was impossible. He was the most famous man in Europe overnight, his name in every letter, every court dispatch, every harborside conversation from Lisbon to London. Somewhere in all that celebration, in the flush of that extraordinary spring, the complications were already growing. Because the news had also arrived in Portugal. King João II, the same João II who had turned Columbus down a decade earlier, the king whose own royal commission had correctly identified the mathematical error in Columbus's calculations, was now sitting with a very uncomfortable problem. What if the commission had been right about the math and wrong about the conclusion? What if there really was land out there in the west? Not Asia, maybe, but land. And now Spain had a claim on it. Portugal had its own legal framework for this, a papal document from years earlier that had divided future discoveries between the two Iberian powers, Portugal getting exclusive rights to Africa and its sea route to India, Spain getting everything else. But the specifics of the line on that map had just become urgently, financially important. The two kingdoms negotiated. The result, in 1494, was the Treaty of Tordesillas, a line drawn down the middle of the Atlantic, everything west going to Spain, everything east going to Portugal. Two superpowers dividing a world they hadn't fully mapped yet between themselves, not particularly consulting the people who lived in that world. It was one of history's most audacious property agreements. In 1498, Portugal cashed its half of that agreement in spectacular fashion. A navigator named Vasco da Gama left Lisbon with 4 ships, sailed south down the African coast past the Cape of Good Hope, turned north along Africa's eastern side, crossed the Indian Ocean, a body of water that Arab and Indian sailors had been navigating for centuries, but that Europeans were arriving in for the first time, and pulled into the port of Calicut on the southwest coast of India. The real India, not islands in the Caribbean, not a speculative outer rim of the Chinese Empire, the actual subcontinent, the Hindu temples, the thriving ports, the warehouses stacked with black pepper and cinnamon and ginger, the merchant classes that had been trading across the Indian Ocean for 1,000 years. Da Gama bargained badly at first. The King of Calicut was distinctly unimpressed by the trinkets the Portuguese had brought as gifts. Accustomed as he was to the sophisticated merchants of Arabia and Persia, but Da Gama loaded what pepper and cinnamon he could get and sailed back to Lisbon with the proof. Portugal had found it. The real sea route to the real India. The news landed in Spain like a cold wind off the Atlantic. Because if Vasco da Gama had found the actual India, with actual Indian temples, actual Indian merchants, actual Indian spices in actual Indian quantities, then what exactly had Columbus found? By the time da Gama returned to Lisbon in triumph, Columbus was already on his second voyage. The second expedition was a different animal entirely from the first. This wasn't exploration, this was colonization. 17 ships, somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 men. Priests, soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, administrators. The intent was not to find something and come back to report. The intent was to stay. Columbus led this fleet back across the Atlantic in September of 1493 and arrived in the Caribbean to find new islands: Dominica, Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, each one catalogued and claimed and named. Each one another piece of evidence for what he believed he was building, a Spanish maritime empire on the eastern approaches to Asia. Then he returned to Hispaniola, to La Navidad, to the 39 men he had left behind in their small fort, with their cannons from the dead Santa Maria. He found ash and bones. The fort was burned to the ground. Not a single one of the 39 men had survived. What had happened was not, on reflection, difficult to understand. 39 Spanish soldiers, isolated on an island, with no supervision and no accountability, and the understanding that they were the representatives of a conquering power. They had behaved accordingly. They demanded gold from the Taino. They took women. They terrorized villages. They stole food. The chief, Guacanagari, who had been so hospitable to Columbus, had apparently tried to restrain the violence, but his authority only went so far. Another local chief had eventually had enough and attacked the fort, and the Spaniards' cannons hadn't saved them. Columbus absorbed this, set his jaw, and kept going. He established a new settlement, La Isabela, the first planned European town in the Americas, with streets laid out and a church begun, and a warehouse for storing whatever gold could be collected from the surrounding countryside. What followed on Hispaniola over the next several years was a template for colonial violence that would be copied, with variations, across 2 continents over the next 2 centuries. Columbus and his brothers, he brought Bartholomew and Diego to help govern, imposed a gold tribute on the Taino population. Every adult man had to deliver a set quantity of gold dust to the Spanish, every 3 months, or a set quantity of cotton if gold wasn't available. Those who failed to pay had their hands cut off. The tribute system was impossible. Hispaniola didn't have unlimited gold deposits. The Taino, who had been living in relative comfort and stability for generations, were suddenly being worked to death in rivers and mines, dying from the labor, dying faster from the diseases that the Spanish were carrying and the Taino had no immunity to: smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses so new to this side of the world that they moved through populations like wildfire through dry grass. The Taino had no biological defenses. Tens of thousands died within years, in some places within months. When Columbus first arrived on Hispaniola, the island's Taino population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Within decades, the Taino of Hispaniola would be functionally extinct. An entire civilization, ancient and complex and complete in itself, burned away in the lifespan of a single generation. Columbus himself was not a bystander to this. He ordered it. He enforced it. He was, by the standards of any era, and certainly by the standards of contemporary Spanish clergy, who witnessed what he was doing and protested it, a brutal and ruthless colonial administrator. His third voyage, in 1498, took him south of his usual track, and for the first time he saw something that should have been impossible according to his mental map of the world. a coastline that didn't end. He was sailing along the northern edge of what we now call South America, the mouth of the Orinoco River, a flow of fresh water so enormous that it diluted the ocean for miles offshore. Columbus stood on the deck of his ship and felt the cold, fresh water against his hand where he trailed it over the side, and he thought, no island can produce a river like this. No island has the watershed to generate this volume of fresh water. This was something else. This was land of a size he hadn't accounted for. He wrote in his journal that he might be approaching what he called _7_, words that haunt historians because they suggest that somewhere in the back of Columbus's ferociously committed mind, a doubt was stirring, but he suppressed it. He wrote a few lines later that he still believed this was connected to Asia, that he was simply misreading the geography. He turned the ships around and headed back to Hispaniola. The doubt got buried. Columbus never looked at it again. What he couldn't bury was the disaster waiting for him on Hispaniola. In his absence, the colony had descended into chaos. The Spanish settlers were in open revolt against Columbus's brothers. The Taino who hadn't died of disease or overwork had retreated into the mountains or were fighting back. Competing factions of Spanish colonists were executing each other. The gold promised to investors back in Spain was not materializing in the quantities anyone had imagined. Word reached Ferdinand and Isabella that their viceroy of the Indies was presiding over a catastrophe. They sent an investigator, a royal official named Francisco de Bobadilla, with broad powers to evaluate the situation and report back to the crown. Bobadilla arrived at Hispaniola in August of 1500, stepped off his ship, and saw, within hours, the bodies of 7 Spanish rebels hanging from the gallows along the waterfront. Columbus's administration was still executing people. Bobadilla made his assessment quickly. He arrested Columbus. He arrested his brothers. He had all 3 of them put in chains, loaded onto a ship, and sent back to Spain as prisoners. The admiral of the ocean sea crossed the Atlantic for the 3rd time in iron shackles, in the hold of a ship he didn't command. Columbus was 50 years old. His hair was completely white. His joints ached from years at sea in damp ships. His eyes were damaged, a condition called ophthalmia, inflammation of the eyes, possibly from years of staring into sun-reflected water. He had believed himself to be building an empire, and instead he was being shipped home like cargo. The ship's captain offered, apparently with some sympathy, to remove the chains. Columbus refused. He would wear them all the way to Spain, he said. He would appear before the king and queen in chains, and they would see what had been done to the man who had found them a new world. Ferdinand and Isabella did receive him. They released him. They restored some of his privileges, his titles technically, though not the actual power those titles implied, but they did not give him back the governorship of Hispaniola. That door was closed forever. What they gave him in 1402 was ships. One last chance. A 4th voyage. Columbus was already a diminished figure when he set out on this final voyage, and somewhere inside himself he seems to have known it. The great objective, proving that his Indies were the real Indies, finding the strait that would take him through to the Indian Ocean, had acquired a quality of desperation. He needed to be right. The alternative was to have been wrong, spectacularly and historically and expensively wrong, and to have presided over a catastrophe in Hispaniola, and to have received chains for it. The alternative was to have ruined everything. He sailed along the coast of Central America for months. Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama. He was looking for a strait, a gap in the landmass that would let him through to the South Sea, the ocean that the local people described as being just over the mountains to the west. He never found it. There was no strait. The Isthmus of Panama is solid land. The ocean he was smelling on the wind over those mountains, the Pacific, was real, but it was separated from the Caribbean by miles of jungle and stone that no 16th century ship could cross. His ships, meanwhile, were dying under him. Wooden hulls in tropical water are prey to a particular worm, the Teredo nivalis, which bores through submerged timber with quiet, relentless efficiency, leaving it as spongy and porous as old cork. Had them dragged onto the beach, and grounded, he was marooned. For over a year, Columbus was stranded on Jamaica. He sent his best navigator in a canoe with local guides to paddle the 100 or so miles to Hispaniola, a journey across open Caribbean water in a dugout canoe, which speaks to the extremity of the situation, carrying a letter pleading for rescue. The governor of Hispaniola, by then a man named Nicolas de Ovando, was in no particular hurry to save Columbus. The two men had history. Ovando sat on the rescue for months. Columbus, on the beach in Jamaica, managed his stranded crew through a combination of negotiation, authority, and one act of calculated brilliance. His astronomical tables told him that a total lunar eclipse was coming on a particular night in February. When the local Taino, who had been supplying his crew with food, threatened to cut off provisions, Columbus warned them, with great theatrical solemnity, that he had the power to extinguish the moon. The eclipse came on schedule. The moon darkened and reddened in the sky. The terrified Taino begged Columbus to restore it. He agreed, retreated to his hut to quote 8, and emerged when the eclipse was ending to announce that food would be accepted as payment for the moon's return. It was clever. It was manipulative. It was also the act of a man who was desperately, profoundly alone on a beach, far from home, running out of everything, watching his last expedition collapse around him. Rescue finally came in June of 1504. Columbus was brought back to Hispaniola and then back to Spain, arriving in November of that year. Isabella, the one person at the Spanish court who had truly believed in him, was dying. She died within weeks of his return. Columbus spent the last 2 years of his life fighting. He was ill, nearly immobile some days from the combination of arthritis and the eye condition that was slowly destroying his vision. But his energy for legal combat was undiminished. Letters went out by the week. Petitions piled up at court. The financial settlement the original contract had promised, 1/10 of all wealth from the new territories. He demanded it in writing, repeatedly, with the persistence of a man who had nothing left but grievance. His son Diego's rights, his own titles, the recognition that history owed him, all of it argued, documented, pressed. He was, depending on who you ask, either a man being cheated of what he'd righteously earned, or a man whose documented catastrophic mismanagement of Hispaniola made his claims awkward at best. The Spanish court was inclined toward the latter view. Ferdinand ignored him, more or less. There were new men, new voyages, new horizons. Columbus was the past. On the 20th of May, 1506, in a modest house in the city of Valladolid, Columbus died. His sons were with him. There were no crowds outside, no state funeral. Contemporary records barely mention it, a small notice in a ledger, essentially, that a navigator had died. He was 54 years old. And he died, with absolute certainty, believing that the islands he had found were the eastern approaches of Asia, that he had proven, at the cost of everything, the western route to the Indies, that the continent we call America was Asia, and that Hispaniola was close to China, and that the strait he'd been looking for on that last desperate voyage was real and merely unfound. He did not know that he had discovered a new world. He did not know that a German mapmaker was in the process of naming that new world after someone else entirely. Let's talk about Amerigo Vespucci, because this is where the story of the naming gets genuinely strange. Vespucci was a Florentine merchant who had been living in Seville, working for a commercial house that supplied ships for Atlantic expeditions. He was not a naval commander of Columbus's stature. He participated in voyages to the coast of South America, probably between 1499 and 1504, in a somewhat murky series of expeditions. His exact role on these voyages is disputed even now. What is not disputed is what he understood. He understood what Columbus refused to. Vespucci looked at the coastline of South America, and it was a coastline that kept going. He looked at the river systems, enormous beyond anything Europe had, draining watersheds that implied a continental landmass of staggering size. He looked at the peoples and the plants and the animals and compared them to everything known about Asia, and he arrived at a conclusion that required no mathematics more complex than looking at what was in front of him. This was not Asia. Ptolemy had never described it. Marco Polo had never mentioned it. Arab geographers had no name for it. The ancient world had no record of it. This was a fourth part of the world. Not Europe, not Asia, not Africa. Something entirely new, unknown, unaccounted for in all of human geography until this moment. He called it A_quote_9__, a new world. Vespucci wrote letters describing this conclusion, and those letters circulated through Europe's intellectual and court culture with the speed that revolutionary ideas tend to move when the moment is ready for them. People read his accounts and felt the ground shift under their assumptions. A fourth continent, something the ancients had missed. The world was larger, much larger, than anyone had believed. In 1507, in the small town of Saint-Dié, in what is now northeastern France, a group of scholars and cartographers were working on an updated edition of Ptolemy's geographical treatise. They were trying to incorporate the new discoveries into the framework of ancient knowledge, which was like trying to fit a continent into a drawer. One of them, a cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller, was assigned the task of drawing the new maps. He drew South America, the coastline that Vespucci had described, the shape that was slowly emerging from the accumulated reports of a dozen expeditions. And he had to name it. What do you call this thing? What do you call a continent that no one knew existed until 12 years ago? Waldseemüller named it after the man who had understood it, America. From quote 10, quote the Latinized version of Amerigo, the first name, not even the last name, of Amerigo Vespucci. Not Columbia, not Fernandina for Ferdinand of Spain, not Isabelia, not anything that honored Columbus. America for the man who figured out what it was. Waldseemüller's maps spread across Europe. Copies were made and carried from library to library, court to court. The name traveled with the map. Within a generation, it had stuck so thoroughly to the landmass that no subsequent attempt to rename it got any traction. Columbus's name is not on the continent he found. There are countries named Columbia, and a river, and a district, but the continents, North and South America, bear the name of a man who participated in several voyages there, understood what he was looking at, wrote it up clearly, and got his first name on the largest real estate in the Western Hemisphere. The ironies in this story compound like interest. Here's the question that haunts the edges of everything we've covered. Why Columbus? Why does Columbus get the credit, such as it is, and by now you've heard enough to know it's complicated, when Leif Eriksson was there 5 centuries earlier? The answer isn't satisfying, and it isn't fair, but it is real. The Vikings found Vinland. They built there, lived there, buried their dead there. Thorvald Eriksson's bones are in American soil, 1,000 years old. The evidence is at Lonso Meadows, sitting in the ground in Newfoundland. Indisputable. But Vinland did not change the world. The Norse settlements were gone within a generation. The knowledge of them retreated north into Iceland and Greenland, and eventually collapsed into legend. The maps of the wider world didn't change. European trade routes didn't shift. No monarch sent additional ships. No wave of immigration followed. The Skraelings, whoever they were, whatever they were building on this continent, went on exactly as before. It was a finding that went nowhere. Columbus's crossing was different in every way that mattered historically. He had the backing of a major European power. He had the communications infrastructure, printing presses, maritime courts, diplomatic networks, to disseminate what he'd found. He had the contractual arrangement with Spain that made follow-up voyages politically and financially inevitable. He had, in short, the machinery of European civilization behind him, in a way that Leif Eriksson, operating out of a struggling colony on the edge of Greenland, never could. The result was a chain reaction that started in 1492 and is still going on. Within a decade of Columbus's first crossing, European ships were making the Atlantic Passage routinely. Within 2 decades, the first permanent Spanish settlements in the Caribbean were established.
Within 3 decades, Hernán Cortés had walked into Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, a city larger than any in Europe, with a market that amazed even battle-hardened Spanish soldiers, and dismantled it. Within 4 decades, Francisco Pizarro had done the same to the Inca Empire in South America, marching into Cusco with a small force and bringing down a civilization that had ruled from Ecuador to Chile. The gold Columbus had promised, and struggled to find in the Caribbean, came pouring out of Mexico and Peru in quantities that dwarfed anything Europe had seen. Spain became, briefly and dazzlingly, the wealthiest country in the world. The silver mines of Potosi, high in the Bolivian mountains, produced so much metal that Spanish silver coins became the first genuinely global currency, used from Manila to Amsterdam to the markets of West Africa. The Portuguese and French and English and Dutch watched Spain's windfall and scrambled to claim their own piece of the New World. The coast of North America was mapped, then settled, then fought over. Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, the slow, grinding construction of what would eventually become the United States. A country that is, in some fundamental sense, the most direct, long-term consequence of Columbus kneeling on a beach in the Bahamas in October of 1492. Every one of those dominoes traces back to a single point of origin. October of 1492, a beach in the Bahamas, a man who thought he was in Asia. The error was the engine. Columbus's gift to history was not accurate navigation. It was the specific shape of his ignorance. An ignorance so precise in its dimensions that it made the crossing feel survivable, when the truth would have made it look like suicide. The cost of that chain reaction was enormous, beyond easy accounting. Historians estimate that within a century of Columbus's first crossing, the population of the Americas fell by somewhere between 50% and 90%. The range reflects the uncertainty about how many people were there to begin with, not uncertainty about the catastrophe. The cause was partly violence, partly the brutal labor systems of colonial mining and agriculture, but overwhelmingly, preponderantly, the cause was disease. The people of the Americas had been separated from the rest of the world's disease pools for thousands of years. They had no immunity to smallpox, to measles, to typhus, to influenza. When European sailors arrived carrying these diseases in their blood, the results were unlike anything in recorded history. Entire villages emptied before Spanish soldiers even arrived. Populations that had numbered in the millions collapsed within a generation. The Taino of Hispaniola, the people Guacanagari had sent out to greet Columbus with food and hospitality, were effectively gone within 50 years of that first meeting on the beach. The civilization Columbus described so admiringly in his first journal entries, gone. The language they spoke, gone. The cosmology they held, the songs they sang, the stories they told, almost entirely lost. The African slave trade that replaced their labor is a separate catastrophe that emerges directly from this one. The plantation economies of the Caribbean and the American South were built on the forced migration of millions of people from West Africa, kidnapped and transported across the Atlantic to work land that had been cleared of its original inhabitants by disease and violence. The consequences of that trade are woven through American history in ways that are still being reckoned with. Columbus did not design these outcomes. He didn't foresee them, didn't plan them, couldn't have. But he opened the door, and the centuries that followed walked through it. Stand back far enough from this story, and what you see is something almost Greek in its architecture. A tragedy that doubles as a triumph that generates catastrophe, a catastrophe that builds a civilization that still hasn't fully settled its account with the people it replaced. Three men at the center of it. None of them quite what they appear. Leif Eriksson, who found the continent and lost it to history, who was genuinely first and genuinely forgotten, who stands in the sagas as a quiet rebuke to the idea that discovery is a matter of priority, that being first is enough. Leif found America, and America found nothing in Leif. No empire followed him. No maps changed. He was a beginning that didn't begin anything. Amerigo Vespucci, whose name is on the continent, whose role in the actual discovery was modest, and whose main contribution was clarity of thought, the willingness to look at what was in front of him and say, simply, "This is something new," without the ego investment in a particular wrong answer that blinded Columbus. He got the most valuable piece of real estate in history, named after him, because he was willing to be intellectually honest, at a moment when intellectual honesty was almost revolutionary. And Columbus, brilliant and brutal, visionary and vicious, a man whose fatal calculation error was also his enabling one, who was spectacularly wrong about where he'd arrived and spectacularly right that the crossing was possible, who promised Isabella and Ferdinand Asia and give them something greater and something darker than any of them could have imagined. He is buried, after a complicated post-mortem journey through several continents, in the Cathedral of Seville, where his coffin rests on the shoulders of 4 carved kings, the monarchs of the ancient kingdoms of Spain, bearing him up through the centuries. It's an oddly fitting image. History carrying him even now. A man who spent his life demanding recognition, finally getting it. From stone giants in a dark cathedral, in a city, in a country that gave him ships to cross an ocean toward the wrong shore. He was looking for India. He found something that would eventually produce more wealth, more innovation, more upheaval, more suffering, and more possibility than India ever did or could. He found a continent of 1 billion people, people who weren't there yet, who would come from Europe and Africa and Asia over the centuries that followed, who would build cities and universities and empires and republics on land that belonged to someone else. He found the place that would one day put men on the moon. He found the place where, 5 centuries after his bones were laid in that cathedral, you might be watching this video right now. He never knew. He died sure of a different story, the wrong story. The story of a mariner who found the sea route to the Indies. He never read the maps with his name on them, because there are no maps with his name on the continent. There are only maps with someone else's name, in letters big enough to cover both hemispheres, and Columbus's name in smaller print on a country to the north of South America, and a few rivers, and a city in Ohio. But here's the thing about history that the textbook version always gets slightly wrong. History doesn't ultimately care who got there first, or who had the right idea, or whose name is largest on the map. History cares who changed the trajectory, who moved the needle, whose error, or whose courage, or whose refusal to turn back in the face of a dying crew and 3 weeks of empty ocean, set off the chain of events that made the next 500 years. The Vikings found America and returned home. The knowledge drowned in the fog off Iceland and became a story, then a myth, then a fairy tale that turned out, against all odds, to be true. Columbus found America, and the world cracked in half along the fault line of that discovery, and everything that came out of that crack, the gold and the blood, and the religions and the languages, and the epidemics, and the empires, and the slaves, and the revolutions, and the republics, is still pouring out. 500 years later, and we are still reckoning with October 12, 1492. The morning Rodrigo de Triana screamed into the dark, the morning the old world ran out of room and the new one began. The morning a weaver's son from Genoa stepped ashore on a beach he would never correctly identify, planted a flag in sand that didn't belong to him, and accidentally handed the future a continent. He never found what he was looking for. He found something no one knew to look for.
That is why we still say his name.